what we saw was quite astounding in terms of it was kind of like there was just so much that they owned, and some of it's really petty, but it's but it's like things like they charge a scout up, and they charge a council to run a public loo. It's kind of their tentacles stretch just about everywhere across the UK.
An investigation by the Sunday Times and Channel 4 Dispatches has revealed how the private property empires that fund the King and Prince William are making millions without having to open their books to proper scrutiny. The Duchy of Lancaster and the Duchy of Cornwall operate as private companies, but don't have to declare what their earnings are spent on. They can charge government departments, councils, businesses, mining companies and the general public via a series of commercial rents and feudal levies on land largely seized by medieval monarchs. So it seems we may all be doing our bit without knowing it to improve the royals' bottom line. Let's speak now to Jonathan Calvert, who is editor of the Sunday Times Insight Investigations team. Morning to you, Jonathan.
Good morning.
I mean, this is an staggering investigation, quite frankly, and a very long, in-depth investigation. I know it took a long time. Just take us through the main things that you found out during this investigation.
Well, we got the complete list of properties that are owned by the two property estates of the King and the Prince, which are the Duchy of Lancaster and the Duchy of Cornwall. That's something like 5,410 properties, and in there was a staggering amount of. Once we had the list, we could then get leases and contracts. And so, actually, what's quite really fascinating about it was not just what they owned, but how much money they were getting for these things. And so, we'd find, for example, that the King, who's a great supporter of the NHS. Was charging £11 million over 15 years to an NHS hospital for a warehouse, or that the Prince was charging £37.5 million to the Ministry of Justice to run a prison, but there was a kind of what was interesting about it was that it was almost like a lot of this is based on land that goes back to feudal times, seized by medieval monarchs, and so they kind of own large areas of the coastline or things like that. And so if you took a place like, say, Liverpool, not a place you'd assume there was an awful lot of royal involvement, but they own the north side of the Mersey, and so therefore there's a big container ship, one of the biggest in Europe, container ship port. They own 30p for each container that goes on shore, which is a minimum of £150,000 a year. Next to that are four wind turbines, and they make £560,000 out of it. And it goes on, and again, it's the Jerry Marsden ferry, there's the Mersey Gateway Bridge, and then further up the coast, they're making huge amounts of money from wind farms, because there's a big wind farm in the sea, and in order for the wind farm to bring the electricity on shore, they have to run it across the King's beaches. And the King will earn, over the length of the 50-year leases, around about £28 million for that. And so it's kind of what we saw was quite astounding in terms of it was kind of like there was just so much that they owned, and some of it's really petty, but it's like things like they charge a scout up, and they charge a council to run a public loo. It's kind of their tentacles stretch just about everywhere across the UK, and we produced a big interactive map for the paper, and so that people for the first time can actually go and see what it is that the King and the Prince actually own. I mean, Parliament has asked for this before, but was never granted it.
There has been certainly that lack of transparency in the past, hasn't there? And we must also talk about the tax arrangements, because they do have special tax arrangements. Some people listening to this will say, well, fair enough, they own this land, they make money from it, they need to support themselves on top of the sovereign grant as well. But they do have special tax status, don't they? They choose voluntarily to pay income tax, but they don't pay corporation tax as other companies would do, and they don't pay capital gains tax either if they sell assets.
That's correct. Yeah, I mean they get about next year they'll get about 132 million from the Crown Estate, and the two duchies earn them around about 50 million. It used to be the case that as a Prince Charles used to declare the amount of tax he paid on his duchy income, but he stopped doing that since he moved to the Duchy of Lancaster, and for whatever reason, we don't know why, Prince William doesn't say. So we don't know how much they pay on income tax, and they only pay a part. They only pay income tax on a part of the income from the duchies that they say is for their personal use. So they will deduct things that they've spent on official duties, etc. And so we can't just look at the fact that they get, say, Duchy of Cornwall gets 23 million and work out what 45% the high rate tax would be of that. And I think there are a lot of people are calling for a greater transparency about this, and especially, and in terms of the tax itself, I suppose. In recent years, the duchies have become incredibly commercial. They've started. We've got a graph online of just how much their income has increased over the last century, and it's enormous. The graph just goes like this. It's shooting up, and they're acting as commercial organisations. So, for example, the King is the patron of the Macmillan Cancer Charity and Marie Curie. They both had offices in a building which the King leases out to Thames Water. Thames Water then charges rents, but the King takes a third of the rents, and those charities have been paying millions, and some of that, and a third of that has been going to the King. And so, if they're going to operate as commercial enterprises in that way, there are people who are saying to us, well, then they should be paying proper business taxes. I mean, as we know from this week, we're all going to have to pay more taxes, and so there are a number of people who think that it's time that Parliament had a proper look at the way the duchies are run in terms of the tax position, to say whether actually it is time for them to start paying taxes just like anyone else.
I'm looking online at the article now, and it's just the kind of, apart from the fact it's fantastic investigative journalism, which Sunday Times does so brilliantly, the all of the interactive elements and the graph, that graph you've just mentioned, Jonathan, I'm just looking at now.
Yeah,
profits from the Duchy of Lancaster and Cornwall. It was under 5 million earlier in the century, before sort of 1960. It was 26 million in 2023. So it just shows it's virtually a vertical line that goes up. Jonathan, really good to speak to you. Thank you so much for bringing that story to us. That's Jonathan Calvert there, editor of the Sunday Times Insight Investigations team. And this is incredible journalism. The detail that is involved in this article, it took so many months for this investigation to go ahead. And I'm looking at the interactive map now, and as you look at it, it's just got a map of Great Britain, and it's just going up with dots everywhere of where they own property and the impact that it has. It's a 5-month investigation. And you can see there are different elements you can click on. You can find out what's happening in your area. It gives you a real insight. I mean, we've only scratched the surface in that conversation, to be brutally honest. So if you've got a digital subscription to the Times and the Sunday Times, head online now to thetimes.com. You can read plenty of detail on that investigation. Alternatively, you can head out and pick up a copy of the paper.
I'd really value your response to that, actually, as you've been listening to Jonathan explain the ins and outs, and as you go and engage with all the interactive maps and things to get a bit more of detail and understanding on it. Some of you commenting online, A. May says they clearly do not need the sovereign grant to fund their lifestyles. They can fund themselves, suggests A. May. And R.H. Sutherland says, wow, I'm a royalist, but this is potentially explosive. The duchies should be handed back to the Treasury and treated in exactly the same way as the Crown Estate.
Michael in Sunbury says, how much does UK PLC make from royalty associated with tourism? Okay, I guess that's the thing. And also, I guess one element as well, and we'll be speaking to a constitution expert later on, but one element is all of this money is obviously going into funding the royals. If they, for example, decide to say we're not going to charge the NHS £11 million to house basically an ambulance warehouse over the next 15 years, would then the public purse have to give them money? Is this money that they require? Would it be money that they would get if they didn't get it this way from the taxpayer? The sovereign grant would have to go up, for example. We'll try and get some answers to that as well, as to kind of, if this money is needed to keep the royal estate running, to function, and is it just a different way of them collecting money rather than just through the sovereign grant?